So the question is, how do we measure time? How do we make meaning of the passing of minutes and hours and years? What are those things that give definition or give depth to the turning of the clock, right? Because we know that, as the song from Rent suggests, time is not just minutes and hours in a day. It's the sunsets, the cups of coffee, the laughter, even the tears. We mark time with stories, right? When we go up to somebody, we don't say, "How many minutes has it been since October 15th? We say, "How long has it been since we met for coffee? When was the last time we took time to actually sit and hang out together? Do you have time in the next week to meet for dinner?" Right? We mark time by stories, by experiences. So what is it that we prepare for, that we celebrate, that we reflect on? When we think about our life stories, maybe we could talk about these things. And there's something really rich about marking stories with rituals, with images, with songs, and with rhythms. You know, when you're gathered at a dinner table for someone's birthday and someone starts a story about the last time, ... and someone else picks it up, and then there's this refrain that gets told every time this story comes around. So when that refrain happens, everybody joins in, right? Maybe we know these kinds of experiences. This is how we measure life, not just by minutes and hours, but by the stories, the moments that we prepare for, that we celebrate, that we reflect on. So in the church, the liturgical calendar gives us the opportunity to measure and make meaning of our faith lives as we mark our lives by the life of Jesus. Let me say that again. The liturgical calendar gives us an opportunity to mark our lives by the life of Jesus. As we live into the life of Jesus each year, beginning with Advent and extending through Christ the King Sunday, we prepare for, we celebrate, we reflect on, and we live into God's presence and action in our lives. So let's start this conversation about the liturgical calendar, being clear on what we mean. For the purpose of today and tomorrow, when I refer to the liturgical calendar, I mean the rhythm of festivals and observations that make up the seasons of the church year. Generally, the liturgical calendar begins near the end of November, with the first Sunday of Advent, and goes through Christ the King Sunday the following November. We'll go into it a little bit more tomorrow, and there are variations in denominations. So if you were raised in other denominations, you may have more specifics or different festivals than what we'll talk about. But generally, the liturgical calendar is 4 Sundays of Advent, 12 days of Christmas, 6 to 8 Sundays in Epiphany that begins with Jesus' baptism and ends with Transfiguration, 40 days of Lent that starts with Ash Wednesday, Holy Week and the 3 days, which people can have all sorts of conversations about. Is Holy Week part of Lent? Is Holy Week its own season? Do we use red? You know what? Whatever, right? We're not going to circle around that. But Holy Week and the 3 days, and by the 3 days I mean Good Friday, Holy Saturday, or Thursday, Good Friday, and Holy Saturday, and then Easter Sunday. 50 days of Easter that ends with the celebration of Pentecost, and then a long season of Pentecost called Ordinary Time. This is what we mean when we talk about the liturgical calendar. Within those seasons, there are feast days, there are major festivals, there are minor festivals, there are saint days, there are days of remembrance of this person and that person. This is not a history lesson, and all of those specifics could be an entire other class or workshop. So for this purpose, we're gonna stick on the high level, and we're going to talk about the rhythm of Advent to Epiphany to Lent to Easter to Pentecost and back to Advent. And what are the significant festivals that transition us from one season to the next. And I hope that you will see as we go through this retreat that we mark our lives by the life of Jesus. we mark our lives by the life of Jesus. As we let the stories of Christ's life run into and through the stories of our lives, we experience these stories in a deeper, richer, and more complex way. And we come to a deeper understanding of Christ's life even as we come to a deeper understanding of our life. Because life isn't measured by minutes and hours alone. It's not measured by cups of coffee only, or even just by visits to the doctor. Life is measured by seasons of love. As we mark our lives by the life of Christ, we deepen our connection with the life of Christ. We deepen our connection with the life of those who are marking their lives alongside of ours. Christ's story shows up in our story, and our story shows up in Christ's story. We also deepen our connection to the church. The church throughout history has been observing the liturgical calendar since about the 400s. That's a long time. It's a lot of Advent. It's a lot of Pentecost Sundays. And we deepen our connection to the historical and the universal cloud of witnesses who are the body and presence of Christ in the world. I can think about, I didn't grow up Lutheran, and my mom was Lutheran, and so we had some Lutheran practices in our family, but we weren't predominantly Lutheran. And I remember going to a Lutheran church in Kenya, because my parents were missionaries, so I grew up in Kenya. And I remember going to a Lutheran church in Kenya and hearing them talk about the liturgical season that we were part of. And my brother that same Sunday was at a cathedral in Paris, because he had been visiting us and he was on his way back to the States. And so he stopped and went to church in Paris, where they had the same text because they were following the same liturgical calendar. And then we came back to the States, and some friends that were greeting us and welcoming us into our home talked about the sermon that they heard on the same text because they had observed that same Sunday in their congregation. So the liturgical calendar doesn't only help us mark our time together or individually, but it also unifies us with the church around the world, the church throughout history. The saints that we remember on observation days where we say, this is the day that we remember the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Do you know the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Right? This is the day that we remember St. Francis. Can I tell you the story of St. Francis? This is the day that we remember this person or that person. And these opportunities to mark time by story riches us, enriches our lives, and enriches our story as we connect with those who have gone before us. Our story is a communal, connected story. Our story of following Jesus is not an isolated story. It might be an independent story, but it's not an isolated story. So think back on your experiences of time. What stories, what songs, what smells and celebrations come to mind? Right? When I say Christmas, where does your heart go? Are there stories that go with that? Are there smells that go with that? Are there tastes that go with that? Right? If you grew up in the church and I say Advent, right? Can you walk into the sanctuary in your head and see the Advent wreath and see the changing of the colors and wonder what's coming because something is different? Can we see how a season of preparation led to a season of productivity and celebration that maybe led to a season of transition as you began to prepare again? What we're going to find out tomorrow is that the liturgical calendar is this rhythm of preparing, celebrating, reflecting, and living into. Preparing, celebrating, reflecting, and living into. Can we see that in our own lives? Can you see how that season of preparation led to a season of celebration, which led to a season of living into, which led to a season of preparation again, because something else was next on the horizon? The liturgical calendar anchors our lives to the life of Christ. With Christ, we anticipate and experience God breaking into creation with a message of hope. With Christ, we wander through the wilderness, we face temptation, We claim the presence of God as more powerful than death, and we acknowledge that our sin and brokenness keeps us from full communion with God. With Christ, we are called out of death and darkness and raised up to new life in the resurrection. This gives us a powerful awareness of the Holy Spirit who calls us into the world, and with Christ calls us to bring about God's kingdom. This is the rhythm of the liturgical calendar. Advent to Christmas, to Epiphany, to Lent, to Easter, to Pentecost. Anticipation to celebration, to revelation, to reflection, to brokenness, to celebration, to life and growth. This rhythm of liturgical season keeps our lives connected to the life of Christ. But even as the seasons change and come around again, each winter is slightly different than the winter before. Just because we've been through winter doesn't mean we know what this winter's going to be like. Right? When I came back from Kenya, we lived in Minneapolis, and everybody would say to us, "Are you ready for the winter?" There was that winter in 97, and the winter in whatever was that we were there was not nearly as bad as the winter that everybody was talking about. And we kept saying, "Where is this winter that you keep referring to? Where is this snow you keep threatening?" Because they had been through a winter, and they warned us that winter was coming, but our winter wasn't like the winter before. And so it is with our faith lives. One season of preparation is not like another season. One season of celebration is not like another season. The story of Christ connects with us differently each time we live it, each time we live into it. I remember going to church with my mom during the season of Advent one year, or during the season of Lent one year. We were back in the States, and her Lutheran church had Wednesday night services for Lent. And so we went, and they were doing these dramatic presentations. And so each week, someone else from the story from that season of Christ's life would sort of tell their story in costume and drama. And so the kids were invited to sit in the aisle so that we could see whoever was in costume. And I was probably 7 or 8. And I can still remember sitting on the floor in the middle of that sanctuary and hearing the story of the centurion. As this man dressed up like a soldier talked about what it was like to be that soldier that was called to crucify Christ, right? And I can remember being caught up in that story as I sat there on the floor, right? And my mom liked to use Advent as a time to do family devotions, and so we would talk about, and she often liked to use the stories of the prophets to prepare for Christmas. And so I remember sitting around and hearing about Jeremiah and hearing about Isaiah and hearing about David and the covenant that God made with David and being ready for Jesus to come into the world because I was caught up in that story. And so I hope that as we go into tomorrow, as we go into the specifics and the details of this liturgical calendar, that you will see how this story of the church is your story. How this story of Christ's life from birth to death to resurrection and beyond is your story. And the way that as we tell Christ's story, as we tell our story, that gives us hope. Because it means that out of Lent comes Easter. Out of darkness comes resurrection and life. Right? That we know that if we only eat and never fast, then we become fat and gluttonous. And so those times when we are called to live in that fasting space, whether that's physical fasting or whatever, that out of that comes depth of understanding and enlightenment and new learning, right? And we know that anticipation of preparation helps us experience whatever it is that we're waiting for differently than if we weren't preparing. You can think about the difference between knowing that someone is coming, and so spending a couple days getting ready for that visitor. That's a different kind of encounter when that person comes than when someone just shows up on your doorstep and you didn't know they were coming. There's something different in the preparation, in the waiting for, in the anticipating of, right? And so at Advent, we anticipate that God is going to break into the world, and we wonder, what's that going to be like? And we realize, gosh, it's a good thing God's going to break into the world because we sure need it. And so we put our house in order, and then God says, I am with you. Emmanuel is here. Do not be afraid. And then out of that then comes this opportunity for Epiphany. And when we say, aha, God is here. God is indeed here. Not just on Christmas Eve, not just on Christmas morning, but in those moments of revelation. As I encounter someone, and in our encounter we recognize the presence of Christ in our midst. Aha, God is here. And then out of that comes this invitation to say, if God is here, then I am broken. And coming up against that story puts it as a mirror in my life, and I realize, And so then we go into the season of Lent, where we fast, where we repent, where we wander, where we're faced with our brokenness. And out of that then comes this realization that something must die. Something must die in order for Christ to live, in order for God to really take control. And so then we are with Christ on that cross. But then God shows God's self to be more powerful than death and calls us, as God calls Christ, out of death into life eternal. And then that calls us into an experience of Pentecost, where we encounter the Holy Spirit in new ways, and that encounter broadens our perspective, gives us new language, helps us hear the language of other people that we weren't able to understand before, which then leads us out in mission, leads us out into relationship with the world around us. Because this story does something to us as we live in it, as it lives in us, right? So we'll dig into all of that a little bit more tomorrow. So as we go into the rest of this retreat, know that your life is so much more than however many times the minute hand has gone around the clock. Your life is so much more than however many times the earth has gone around the sun. Your life is connected with the life of Christ, and therefore connected with the stories of people throughout history. There is richness in preparing for, in observing the changing of seasons, as it connects us with the rhythm of the earth. And there is richness in preparing for and observing liturgical seasons, as those seasons connect us with the rhythm of Christ. 525,600 minutes. How do you measure the life of a woman or a man in truths that she learned or in times that he cried, in bridges he burned or the way that she died? It's time now to sing out, though the story never ends. Let's celebrate. Remember a year in the life of friends. Remember the love. Seasons of love. What an awesome song that is. I feel like maybe I need to find a way to listen to it this weekend. Right? Let's celebrate. Remember a year in the life of friends. Remember the love. Seasons of love. So as we go into tomorrow, we will be digging into this liturgical calendar. And we will be given opportunity to connect the colors and the rhythms and the rituals of these seasons with our own lives. Because our life is so much more than how many times the minute hand goes around the clock, or how many times the earth goes around the sun. And these seasons connect us with the story of Christ. They connect us with our own story, with the story of other people in our lives, and also with the story of the church throughout history. So I invite you to come and be part of these seasons. Open yourself up to what these seasons can say to you, the way that Christ has been with you through the different parts of your life as you prepare for, as you celebrate, as you observe and reflect on those moments of transition, those opportunities for enlightenment in your own life. And let's see what this story of Christ does to us this time, and open ourselves up to these seasons of faith and our seasons of life. Hoo-yeah, let's do it.